Musical Talk, the UK independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to Musical Talk. I'm Thos and if you think you know that piece of music, perhaps you might, but it was originally the theme tune to a television programme called The Strange World of Gurney Slade, which featured British songwriter and performer Anthony Newley, and he appeared in lots of musicals which are still being performed today, such as Scrooge. He was the first person to play Ebenezer Scrooge in the stage version of the film of A Christmas Carol, the musical version with lyrics by Leslie Bricusse. And of course it's highly appropriate, therefore, that with a Christmas a month away and having just spoken about Scrooge, that we can offer you today, like the ghosts that visited that miser in his house, a show from the past, a show from the present, and a show from the future. We're going to be talking about the forthcoming musical Priscilla, the Queen of the Desert, which had its launch party recently and will be coming to London in 2009. We'll be talking about the new musical Newley, The Fool Who Dared to Dream. And you'll be hearing the second part of the interview with Julian when he talks about Mary Poppins, which was recently in London. So that's the show for today, past, present and future. You're listening to Musical Talk. Listeners with long ears and long memories will remember that in August 2007, I had the opportunity of interviewing David Boyle, who was doing a show about Anthony Newley, who was a well-known British performer and composer, writing such musicals as Stop the World I Want to Get Off, The Roar of the Grease Paint, The Smell of the Crowd, and also the songs for Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, the 1971 version of the film. And I'm pleased to say that I've recently had the opportunity to meet him again for a brief interview about his new show. It's called Newley, The Fool Who Dared to Dream, and it's currently on at the theatre known as Upstairs at the Gatehouse in Highgate. Let's learn more about it. Musical Talk.
I'm David Boyle and I'm playing Newley in Newley, The Fool Who Dared to Dream, up here at the Gatehouse Theatre in Highgate.
Now, this isn't the first time you played Anthony Newley. In fact, listeners to Musical Talk will remember you from Edinburgh in 2007. But this show is not a development of that show. It's a completely new Newley show,
yes,
capitalising on your extreme talents, if I may say.
Thank you.
How did this come about?
This came about a fellow producer friend of mine who suggested I need backing singers in the show just to make it a bigger sounding, bigger moving kind of show. And it wanted to make it something brighter and tell more of the story about Newley rather than my journey I did up in Edinburgh, where it was my journey with Newley.
It was a parallel journey,
it was. And sometimes it got a bit confusing for the audience, but I think the best thing now is that we've got a show that does his whole life story from beginning to end, and it should please everybody. So this producer friend of mine, Joan Lane, suggested meeting Pete Gallagher to co-write and direct and take the show onto somewhere else.
So when you say co-write, obviously you were still one of the writers on it.
No, I came up with the ideas, but it's Pete who wrote the whole script. Yeah.
Now, forgive me, the whole life story is quite an interesting thing to encompass in this is a stage biopic, essentially.
Yeah.
How do you feel approaching all the stages of his life?
Well, it's fast-paced, and I must say...
Just like his life, in fact.
Yeah, I mean, the scenes are 2 minutes or under in between the songs, and there's about 21 songs in there. So we are really pushing against time just to get everything in there, and that's why it's quite fast-paced with... In the vein of Stop the World, really, in that kind of way.
And how do you feel that your performance has changed individually? I mean, do you feel you have a greater understanding of Newley as you've gone on? Because, I mean, you were pretty close there, I thought, last year.
Well, I think I've gone back to not just an impersonation, but it's more of the flavour of Newley. Before, I think I kind of underplayed it a bit. And so my character, myself and Newley were kind of merging together. So this time it's pure Newley and I mean, he did have those exaggerated vowel sounds and stuff like that, but that's what was pleasing. So we're playing more on that a bit more, and then more of the movement, and it's more of a dynamic show than the other one. The other one seemed a bit dark as well, so this one's a brighter, feel-good version, if so.
And I'm going to have to touch on all of these things. The songs, how did you select the songs? Because there's quite a lot in the Newley catalogue, not just ones he wrote as well, but also things he's synonymous with, the singing, that he didn't necessarily write.
Well, that was a difficult thing, because we didn't know which ones not to to leave out. There's Pure Imagination, which is a fantastic lyrical song, and then you've got Goldfinger, which is, a British standard song, isn't it? So you kind of push, but we couldn't get everything in there. So what we did, we went through a list of songs, and the director Pete said, which ones could you not leave out? And I said, well, you can't leave out Pop Goes a Weasel, we can't miss out things like The Man Who Makes You Laugh and The Fool Who Dared to Dream and What Kind of Fool, obviously, and Who Can I Tell, all those ones in there. But I wanted to put ones in there that haven't been heard so much, like the ones from the good old bad old days and stuff like that, because it's a real rip-roaring kind of songs, those ones.
It's also been greeted with a certain amount of publicity, hasn't it? Some of the broadsheets have done features on Anthony Newley, which...
Yeah, I'm very surprised at that at the moment, because when I was trying to push for a show a few years ago, and people were saying, I can't remember him, who, what, married to Joan Collins, yes, and all that kind of thing. But now there's something in the ether, I think, that there's something that's got to happen. And
you're touching the zeitgeist.
Well, I hope so.
Newley.
Hopefully I'm on the cusp of things. But I just want to tell his story. That was all I ever wanted to do from the word go, was bring him back into the British public. Because he went to America, he was so great over there, and kind of got forgotten here until just before he died.
Yes, he had a cameo on EastEnders, in fact, didn't he?
He did, yeah. And I think one of the chaps who worked on one of the last scenes was in last night to see one of the previews.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I think he...
What kind of feedback have you been getting?
Well, I didn't know which way to take this one. One person said it was amazing. He was miming so well, and I didn't know whether he meant the actual miming I do in the show or miming to the songs.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so that could be a compliment. That could mean that I was sounding exactly like Newley.
Spot on.
Yeah, but you don't know.
You do, but you sing very nicely in your own right. I mean, I don't think we should... I mean, it's quite right that you're performing, channeling Anthony Newley.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't be able to do that if you didn't have the skills yourself.
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, I'd love to sing in my own voice for a change, but this is because my voice is naturally higher, but this is more grounded for me, so I have to work a bit harder. And with the vowel sounds and the London sounds, it's you kind of get those knocked out when you're doing vocal lessons, so you've got to bring all those back.
And just to give us a taste for the audience, in the terms of the way the songs are weaved into the plot, are they songs whereby it's that stage in his life where he sang those songs and you're representing the songs he sang? Or are you in any way making the songs comment upon various aspects of his life?
The latter.
So it's a cleverer show than it's not just a showcase of
No,
what he
it's
did.
not chronological. I mean, we start with What Kind of Fool Am I? Just to throw
you
the cat
would,
amongst the pigeons. And then we finish with The Fool Who Dared to Dream. And it's his journey through life is... originally it was going to be like the fool, acceptance and the money, and these things were going to keep popping up and down, but we couldn't get all those into the show. But essentially you got things like the musical world, when he meets George Pescott and all these other feeling good, those songs are in there for certain reasons in the show, and that's how we colour-coded them to work out where we could place these songs and where would they work better.
So it's been quite intricately plotted in some sense.
Yes, yeah.
Which is good, because it's not just a jukebox musical in that sense. It's it's a catalogue musical.
Yes,
but with some thought and some.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, I'm very pleased about that. And it sounds as though the feedback is doing very well. Where would you like it to go? I mean, is it going anywhere further? Or?
No, well, we don't know yet. I mean, we'll see how we go here, because this is essentially the first outing of it. So we want to see if it works this way. If not, we'll rejig it a bit or something. But essentially, we'd like to tour, bring it back to London, over to America, because I've had conversations with people in the States to say, would you come over here, because they've seen stuff on YouTube and said we'd love to have Newley on stage over here. So
oh, fantastic. Well, that sounds very promising.
Yeah, it's just waiting to see what happens next, I think. So we'll wait and see.
For those people who have heard of Anthony Newley but don't really know what or who he was and what he did, can you briefly describe his importance in British musical theatre terms?
Oh, God. Well, he was kind of the original guy who, along with Lionel Bart, who changed musical theatre in the 60s and really changed everything and brought the little man to life, the ordinary bloke, because normally it was a certain kind of musical, or the MGM kind of musicals, and I think Brickus and Newley wanted that element in there, but with a different kind of story and a different take. And I think they rode their luck well in America, and it kind of broke box office records out there and broke all kind of different grounds as well. So I think he covers a broad generation of people as well. I think it appeals to the younger folk and then to the older generation as well, who remember that time. But people know the songs as well, and they think, oh, I remember that song. Oh, I didn't know he wrote that. I didn't know he sang that.
Because he's man of many parts as well. I mean, he sang pop songs as well as more traditional songs. He wrote songs, he acted. He's in Dr. Dolittle, isn't he?
Yeah.
He turns up in places you don't expect.
Yeah, no, he's been in everything. And the Lakes, one of the last things he did on TV was so sublime. It was one of those underplayed kind of naturalistic kind of acting, and because he was a bit of a ham. He was a bit, like the best of them. But this seeing him in the Lakes was something completely different.
Because he also did Noel Coward, didn't he, with Joan Collins?
Yes, yeah. I think Present Laughter, wasn't it? Yeah. So I'm that's my aim anyway. Is to that was all the aim was. It wasn't self-promotion or anything like that. It was just to say, right, this is him. This is my idol. This is I'm a big fan, and I just want his name up in lights again.
So really it's an attempt to resurrect his memory, which really has been very sadly forgotten, though.
Yeah.
Do you have any reason? Do you have any thoughts about why that would be?
Well, I think you get when people make a success here and then they go to America and then they kind of don't come back. I suppose he didn't come back for a while because the money was good in Vegas when he was doing the cabaret scene, and then that dried up, and then I suppose he didn't have any money, so he comes back, and then the British press and public probably say, oh well, I don't want you back. You turned your nose up. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the way things are, and that's the sad reality, I suppose, of this country. Kind of, you bring them up and then you knock them down again, and it's a different thing in America, isn't it?
And do you touch upon? I have to ask this. Do you touch upon Gurney Slade in your?
Oh, we do.
Oh, fantastic.
Yes, we do. We do just a tiny bit of that. I don't think there's anything we may have missed out. I mean, we couldn't get all the films in, obviously, but because he did all those films in the 50s. But there's a pop medley with Idle on Parade and Pop Goes a Weasel and those ones. From everything.
Strawberry Fair?
Yeah, well, I'm not singing that, but there's an introduction to that gives you a flavour. And
it gets touched upon.
Yeah. So there's all those kind of things. My favourite is That Noise, but it's...
I don't know that one.
Oh, well, I won't sing it. But it's it was kind of one of those comedy records of the 60s, the early 60s, him and Brickus wrote. Because Brickus did the lyrics and Newley was the music, and I didn't know that until a few years ago. I thought it was just the two of them hand in hand, but it's more so Newley did all the music. So.
And has Leslie Brickus... Has he been in any way contacted or involved
in
this?
Yeah, I met him a few months ago.
Because he was back in London for a while, wasn't
he? I saw him with the director Pete Gallagher, and when we went to his flat, and he was just telling us all about their days together and going through these old archives of scrapbooks from Stop the World, all the rehearsals, and he's showing us pictures from those rehearsals. It was amazing to see that, because you just don't see it, and there's nothing out there of Newley. No. There's nothing at all, and you see this at first hand. So he's behind it, the family behind it. I don't know if Joan knows of it. I presume she does through Tara and Sasha. But everybody, his old agent, he's behind it. Everybody seems pleased that something's happening.
Oh, I'm very pleased, because Leslie Brickus is still a force in writing, isn't he?
He's still working. Yeah, he doesn't stop, does he?
He's not a young man.
No.
Oh, well, I'm really pleased about that. And the final thing I'm going to have to say, by the way, is what a fantastic cover on the which I believe you designed. Is that right?
Well, I did the illustration. Yeah, I did the illustration because I'm an artist as well, so I did that, and my mate did the design. So yeah,
it's an extremely striking caricature. I think is the best way of describing it.
Yeah, it is. I try to get that kind of Al Hirschfeld kind of feel to it, and that was so theatrical kind of feel to that era as well, and bring that 60s feel to it with the spotlight and everything else. But it just sums him up, I thought.
The cover is fantastic.
Thank you.
If the piece is half as good as the cover, then I'm in for a fantastic time. But I know it'll be more than half as good.
Oh, thank you.
Musical Talk.
Well, that was David Boyle, the star of Newley, The Fool Who Dared to Dream. And if you want to go and see that, you can. It's upstairs at the Gatehouse, and the website is www.upstairsatthegatehouse.com, and it's on between the 18th and the 30th of November 2008, so you've still got a chance to see it. Well, that's the present show. What about the future show? Well, Musical Talk presenter Josh Boyd Rochford was recently invited to the press launch of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, which is coming to the Palace Theatre from a successful run in Australia already, and it'll be here from March 2009. I chatted to Josh about the experiences of being at the launch party, and we started off by talking about whether he'd ever been to a launch party of a musical before. Now, you got to the launch. Had you ever been to the launch of a musical in this, a big press launch?
The last launch that I was at was actually the Chicago launch, which must have been about 10 years ago?
It's just done 10 years.
Yeah, it's just done 10 years, so it would have been just over 10 years ago. And what they did, and they did exactly the same thing with the Priscilla launch today, was they flew the American cast over, and it was Bebe Neuwirth and Anne Reinking playing Roxy and Velma, and the American cast, and they came over and they did 4 numbers from the show, and then they introduced Ute Lemper and Ruthie Henschel, who were going to be playing their counterparts in London, and then they flew them all home. And we all got a goodie bag with a soundtrack and a programme and a press release and a little keyring, actually. Little handcuff keyring.
It's all merchandise.
It was all merchandise, yeah, merchandise-tastic, everything. Although, interestingly, I don't recall the West End being quite so much about merchandising as it is these days.
I think that's a trend that's developing everywhere, any way of making some money. But so, one goes to launch. What do you sit in? Is it in a theatre?
It was at the Palace Theatre, which is where Spamalot's currently playing.
And we're talking the Priscilla one, aren't we?
Yes, and
that's where it's going.
Yes, and that's where Priscilla is going into in the new year.
And that's quite a high-profile venue, so they've also got high hopes for this show.
Do you know, I think the Palace has got to be one of the most high-profile venues in London, I really do. Part of that is geographical location. I mean, it's right in the heart of Theatreland.
Cambridge Circus.
Absolutely. But the other reason, I think, is that Les Miserables was there for such a long time. So everybody would just say, I'll meet you at Les Miserables.
Yeah.
And that's where you'd meet people when you were going into town.
There were many of us Londoners who've lived here all our lives who didn't know it was called the Palace Theatre until Les Mis finished.
Yes, because it was Whistle Down the Wind for a while, wasn't it? And it was Woman in White. And I'll Meet You at the Woman in White didn't have the same ring to it as I'll Meet You at Les Mis.
Many of us have never been to a press launch for a musical, so how was it today for Priscilla? This is presumably has been on in America, hasn't it?
No, I don't. It hasn't opened in America yet. I think that's planned for next year. It's been playing in Australia.
Oh, right.
So
it's an established
for
musical.
about 2 years it's been playing in Australia, so it's been established out there, and I would assume that they've been trying to bring it to London for quite a long time. I first heard about it coming to London about a year ago, so I would assume it's taken that length of time to get it here. It began with a brief introduction from the producer, and then went straight into one of the opening numbers of the show.
A big cast piece?
A big cast piece. Well, I mean, there are 30 in the cast. They hadn't brought all of them over today. They'd brought over 6 of the principals and some of the chorus. But it's just really to give you a taste. And obviously it's on the Spamalot stage with the Spamalot set still there. So you're not really getting that much of a taste of what it's actually going to look like, because, I mean, Priscilla is just a riot of colour and makeup and outrageous costumes and outrageous performances. And, of course, Priscilla itself. It's interesting that the title role of this musical is actually a bus. So the bus itself must take up quite a huge part of the stage. So it was quite a stripped-back production, but it still gives you some kind of idea of the energy and the colour and the vibrancy that this show is going to bring to London.
Is this going to be a spectacle show?
Interesting. In the sense that Lord of the Rings was a spectacle show, I would say yes, but this is as much about the story, and it's a very emotional story.
It's quite touching.
Yeah,
the film is certainly touching.
And they've made some changes to the stage show so that to sort of heighten that emotion. I mean, if you remember in the film, Tick, one of the drag queens, doesn't discover that he has a son until the very end of the film. So the journey of the film is actually about these 3 drag queens on a sort of road trip and discovering themselves, and then it moves into this sort of extra story. From the beginning of the stage show, it is actually about Tick on this journey to discover his son, to find his son. So the audience, that conceit is taken away. The audience knows about the son, Tick knows about the son, we're all in on that together, and we all go on that journey with Tick. So there's that journey. Then there's the love story between Bernadette, the transsexual, and Bob. There's that story, and then there's the story of Adam, the younger drag queen, discovering himself and learning from the 2 older drag queens as he goes along. So it is a heightened emotional experience, really. So you've got this emotional story, but then you've got these incredible dance routines. I think it's going to blow most people's socks off, actually. I think it's going to be quite unlike anything that we've seen in London. Although, musicals are getting bigger, aren't they? So
it seems.
We have to just keep competing and seeing if we can top things. And, of course, one of the things about Priscilla is that it's lip-syncing. These drag queens lip-sync. How do you not do that in a musical when actually that's part of the story? So they've created this conceit of these three divas, female performers, who sing all of those lip-synced numbers and are on stage and are part of the action, and they sing it.
Oh.
But they also provide what the director described as a sort of a descant to the emotional heart of the show, so that they kind of explore the inner feelings and the inner emotions of the characters through song. So it's not a lip-synced show at all. And the numbers where the three drag queens do lip-sync, they are actually still sung live because the three divas are on stage singing those numbers. But the whole thing is just this riot of colour. It really looks like if it moved, they tied it down and threw sequins at it. That's kind of what it looks like, and I think that's where they're going with it.
Now, I'm getting from the enthusiasm you're giving to me, not least from the hand movements, that you enjoyed it.
Well, yeah, I did. For me to enjoy something that is so stripped down and doesn't have the lights and the staging and, just all of those elements that bring a production together, for me to have enjoyed it, it must have really moved something in me. Now, it is an incredible film, and I loved it. And so I remember loving the film and watching the film over and over and over again, because it is an emotional journey and it is a very heartfelt story. But this really, it did everything that, to me, a musical is meant to do. The music enhanced the emotion of the piece. It didn't detract from it. It's one of those musicals where the music is both a part of the story, but also does what musicals just do so magically, just explores the story as well. So it's not just these numbers that come out of, the drag queen's performance. It's also about people expressing their emotion, and that old idea of a musical is when your emotions are too heightened for you to speak, you just have to burst into song. And it's that kind of feel to it as well. So it's got everything in it.
You said the first number that you saw was a kind of opening number. The other three numbers, there were four in total, I think.
There were three today, three numbers.
How were the other two?
The other one, and this goes back to this idea of the three divas providing the descant and the emotional sort of thought process in the show. The other one was Tick singing a love song to his son. Oh, wow. And it was I say a little prayer. So the moment I wake up, before I put on my makeup, I say a little prayer for you. And it was rescored, so it began as a ballad, and then they brought the little boy on stage. So, it's one of those shows that's really going to tug at every heartstring imaginable. They brought this little boy on stage, and he stood there looking very sweet. No, he did have a wonderful moment where he ran off during the number and looked back at the audience and kind of waved, and I thought, we're going to have problems with that one in a few years' time. But so he sang this song to a portrait that he had of his son, and then the son came on, and then the three divas came on, and they explored the emotional heart of that story.
In the same song?
In the same song, and then it kicked into the dance version of that song that we all know, and it became a big sort of diva-ish shimmy number.
Now, I Say a Little Prayer of You is a well-known number. It's Burt Bacharach, in fact, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is there still room for exploration? Clearly there is, from what you're saying, but you can bring new levels to it and draw things out of the lyric. It has no new lyrics, does it?
No, it has no new lyrics, but those lyrics that we just talked about, it's a woman waking up in the morning, and she's talking about the man that she's in love with, and before she puts on her makeup, ordinary day makeup, or she's wondering what dress to wear, to go to work, to go shopping, to just mundane day to day. This is a man singing it, talking about putting on that outrageous, extravagant makeup that a drag queen wears, and which dress is he going to wear, which character is he going to be today. Is he going to be loud, is he going to be sexy, is he going to be seductive, is he going to be sensual? And yes, it brings something new to those well-known and wonderful lyrics, and suddenly it's a different slant on it.
How much of a score appears to be new, and how much of it is, they've obviously got the rights to some songs?
I don't think any of the score is new at all. They're all classic songs. 25 dance floor classics, including Downtown, I've Never Been to Me, What's Love Got to Do with It, Don't Leave Me This Way, Venus, Go West, I Say a Little Prayer, I Love the Nightlife. Everything you remember from the film is in there.
Even I know these songs.
Even you know these songs.
And I enjoyed the film, by the way, we're on the subject. So let's get on to the third song that was shown, or played, or performed.
The third song was a sort of finale medley, and it's the track Finally. Finally, it's happened to me. Right, it's the last one from the film, as I remember.
You sing divinely.
Yes, I do. It's amazing. I actually make my career I make money out of this business by talking about it mainly, rather than being in it. And so, it features all those costumes that you remember from the film as well. So the one where they seem to burst into flames, and Birds of Paradise and the ostrich. or is it emus? It's probably emus in Australia, isn't it? But big birds on head. And so it features not only all the songs that you recognise from the film, and also you know anyway, but it features all those amazing costumes that you remember from the film.
Must be hell on the dresser.
Well, they were talking about this today, and they were saying the ensemble work harder in this show when they're off stage than they do on stage, because they're constantly changing costumes and their sort of makeup and their headpieces. 200 hats and headdresses are worn in every performance. One contains 25 yellow rubber ducks, another 75 butterflies, and a third is an aquarium complete with fish. At every performance there's over 100 wigs used, 160 masks, and 150 pairs of tailor-made shoes. There are 500 costumes in this show. I mean, this has got to be...
We are talking spectacle.
We are talking spectacle. We are talking probably the most extravagant production that's ever been seen in London. I think it will probably even top Lord of the Rings.
And yet it's essentially a jukebox musical.
It is essentially a jukebox musical. No.
Now that's very interesting. Can I ask, the film, of course, is a gay classic. It's not just a classic, it's a gay classic. How was your audience looking today?
Well, today was sort of, mainly invited industry people, so quite heavy on the gay side. I would imagine that actually this show is going to sell across the board. I think it's going to be one of those, because of the soundtrack, because of the songs, I think it's going to be one of those shows that appeals to your busloads coming in from the home counties. Hen nights. Even stag nights. Now, we all know that, those stag boys, they do love a good drag queen.
So we're talking the Mamma Mia audience in many ways.
We're talking the Mamma Mia audience plus, I think. I think this is going to take Mamma Mia to a new level. I honestly think that this is going to be probably the most extravagant spectacle across the board. Young, old, everyone's going to love this.
I wonder if we'll get to see Pierce Brosnan very badly miscast in a remake in 10 years' time.
I thought Pierce Brosnan actually did very well in that film. I had heard terrible reports about his singing, and actually, he isn't a singer.
He's got a sense of humour.
He's got a sense of humour, and I think in that film that's all you needed, But, I mean, he was up against Meryl Streep and Christine Baranski, and these people can sing.
Walters, yeah.
Even Julie Walters. These people can actually sing and dance and move. And I think he really held his own. He really did. I think, nobody criticised Colin Firth, who I thought was, equally sort of not
yes.
brilliantly cast in that.
It's a perfectly reasonable position. Did you enjoy today, the Priscilla launch?
I did very, very much. I think it's interesting that when they brought the four principals who are going to be playing those roles in the UK, the roles of the three drag queens and Bob, the Australian mechanic, when they brought those four out at the end, they had that same sort of look of embarrassment and not quite sure what to do that Uta Lemper and Ruthie Henschel had 10 years ago when they were brought out at the Chicago launch. And they're literally just sort of wheeled out, they say a few words, and then the Australian company went into this incredible dance routine.
Beat that.
And it was literally like, okay, you don't know the dance moves, you don't know the song, they'd probably only met for the first time this morning. They haven't met any of the rest of the cast because they are still casting it. A lot of the roles have been cast already, but I know that they are still looking for a few people. So, and then they're presented to the world's press, and they kind of have to smile and look happy while being surrounded by these drag queens. It's just one of those press launches can be one of those awkward things.
Or camper than real life.
And this certainly was. They arrived, and I missed the arrival, but they arrived on a huge bus outside Shaftesbury Avenue, and all these drag queens piled out of the bus outside the Palace Theatre on Shaftesbury Avenue.
How entirely appropriate.
Yes, that's what I think.
So there was a question and answer session?
There wasn't a question and answer session. I thought there was going to be, but there wasn't. It was the director said, sort of gave us the story and the history of how this show had come about, and then they introduced the London cast, who all said a few words. And the actor playing the Bernadette character, the transsexual, he's been playing it in Australia for the last 2 years since the show started. So he was a lot more erudite about the production, because obviously he knows a lot more about it. It was just a very interesting sort of snapshot of of it, and then with the sort of general begging for those of us from the industry who are there to go out and publicise it and talk about it and get bums on seats, because that's what it's all about.
You were introduced to the four principals
Mm-hmm.
who were going to be in London. Can we ask who they might be?
Yes, as I've said, Bernadette, the older or the eldest of the three drag queens, is being played by Tony Sheldon, who's been playing the part in Australia for the last 2 years. And this is his first time in the West End, although he was telling us there have been various shows that he's been involved with before that have attempted to come over, one of them being Torch Song Trilogy many years ago, that eventually the part went to Anthony Sher over here, and the other being the producers, that he was going to come over and do that over in the UK, but this is the first time that it's actually all come off for him. Jason Donovan is playing Tick, the middle-aged drag queen.
He's no stranger to musicals, is
He's no stranger to musicals. He was Caractacus Potts, of course.
Yes, he was, and I think he's done Rocky Horror.
He has done Rocky Horror, and of course he's no stranger to anything Australian, having been in Echo Beach.
And being an Australian.
And being Australian. And also he has a 7-year-old son, which links in with the story. I'm not just telling you about Jason's private life. No, he has a 7-year-old son, so that must be quite a journey for him, because the show is about his journey to find his son. I think that will be an interesting part for Jason to be playing. And he's actually looking very, very well. I think he's looking very, very well, considering there was a period when he wasn't looking quite so great. I think he's going to be brilliant in the part.
Anyway, he's got lots of makeup, so
yes,
look doesn't really matter
exactly.
much.
And the youngest of the drag queens is young Oliver Thornton, who most recently played Mark in the recent revival of Rent remixed at the Duke of York's Theatre.
Take Me Baby.
That's the one, and he's looking incredibly well, I must say.
Yeah, well, he might do.
Yes, he's looking very, very good indeed.
Is that the Guy Pearce role?
Yes, that's the Guy Pearce role. And he was saying today how he remembers watching that film when he was young and looking at that role and thinking, what a great part to play. So it's all kind of come full circle for Oliver, and indeed for Jason Donovan, I would assume. Bob, the Australian outback mechanic who falls in love with Bernadette, that's being played by Clive Carter, who of course is one of our great, very, very great West End musical theatre actors, and straight actors, of course. And I think he was last actually at the Palace Theatre in Les Miserables for many years. So
it's a homecoming for him.
Yes, it's a bit of a homecoming for all four of them then, really, I suppose. Although Tony Sheldon has never... No, not a homecoming for him at all. No. It's a going away present for him.
It sounds a wheeze. Now, are you going to go and see the show?
I am absolutely going to go and see this show. My flatmate went to see it in Australia about a year and a half ago.
Bloody hell, that's a long way from East London.
Yeah, I mean, he was doing North London.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
North London.
What was I thinking?
He went out there about a year and a half ago to see it with his partner, and they came back singing the praises of it. So I've been looking forward to it for about a year and a half, not wanting to make the journey to Australia myself to see it. So this has been on the radar for a good long while, and I'm really excited about it, really looking forward to it. And then, once it's opened in the West End, I know that their plans are to take it to Germany and take it to the United States and just roll it out. It'd be interesting for us to have something that hasn't come straight from America, that we're going to send to America, as it were.
Yes. Actually, it's interesting. It's coming from a totally different route, isn't it?
Mm. As I think, as the director said today, hundreds of years ago, we sent a load of convicts to Australia, and they're sending a load of drag queens back.
Fair exchange.
I think fair exchange is absolutely no robbery.
Yeah, I think the deal's quite good for us.
I think we got the better end of that one.
Musical talk.
Well, that was the wonderful Josh Boyd Rochford telling us all about the launch party. Perhaps, like me, you've never actually been invited to one. Well, if you'd like to get a feel of what it's like, we do have today abridged extracts of the launch party for Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. So without further ado, let's listen now to extracts from that event that was held recently in London. And you'll be hearing the voices of Simon Phillips, Clive Carter, Oliver Thornton, Tony Sheldon and Jason Donovan. Let's join the audience just after the opening number has come to an end.
That's pretty special, isn't it? As is this theatre, by the way. I kind of meant to say this, but as I was walking out, I thought, oh my goodness, here we are, a little Australian show in one of the best theatres in London. And I think you should recognise that. Rogue and this theatre are just a very, very special people and a very special place. And we're very happy to be here. I'm Gary. Sorry. G'day. I think I'm sent out here to show you that not all Australian men dress in frocks. and also to tell you a little bit about the history of the show. There's a pretty strong London connection to Priscilla, because the idea to put her on stage began 5 years ago and about 500 feet from here, with a couple of expatriate producers who are best known for an Australian tap dancing show, and Michael Hamlin, who produced the film, and Alan Scott, who's a very well-known Hollywood scriptwriter. It took us about 2 years to work out how to do the show, and even then, after a couple of workshops, we didn't really know that we got it right. Our audiences continue to teach us stuff, but we went through quite a significant development process, because have a think about this. You're dealing with one of the most iconically well-known Australian films, which has a bloody big bus as the title character, and as kind of backdrop, the great Australian outback. How do you do that on stage? It took us a couple of years to work that out. For a long time, we thought we'd have Priscilla as a kind of imaginary beast, you know, maybe a neon outline that folded up into a matchbox or something like that. But in the end, and it strangely enough happened in a snowstorm in Berlin, the creative team agreed that you had to actually have Priscilla on stage. So you will see Priscilla. You probably got a glimpse of her up there. She has a few secrets under her frocks. You will see that too when you come and see the show. But anyway, as part of the development process, of course, we had to find, and we set out to find, some of the greatest creative artists that there are, not just Australian, but generally. Beginning with our design team, Brian Thompson, who, strangely enough, designed Jesus Christ Superstar on this stage and in this theatre. And he tells us that backstage and underneath the stage it hasn't changed at all. And continuing with the costume designers for the film, who won the Academy Award, perhaps you remember, Lizzie Gardner and Tim Chappell, who you've seen a bit of their work. Yeah, go and give them a clap. There's a fair bit more to come, and I have to tell you, you're only going to get a glimpse of what we could afford to bring over as excess baggage. Because there's a lot more. I would venture to suggest that Priscilla is probably the biggest costume show that's ever hit any stage anywhere. We stopped counting after a while. Lizzie and Tim were wonderful, crazy, but wonderful. They were totally unhampered by any of the normal things that our theatre designers have to live with, like practicality and cost. And in a way that was kind of liberating. You know, their imagination was quite amazing, but more importantly, their design aesthetic kind of informed the look of the show. So suddenly, in the outback of Australia, we had dancing paintbrushes and dancing cupcakes and stuff like that. Anyway, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, because you have to come and see the show to see all of that stuff. So it took us quite a while to do that. And the most important person in all of that kind of journey, somebody to whom we owe a fairly significant kind of debt of gratitude, because he is one of the core creators of the show, is our director, Simon Phillips. And I think as much as anybody else that I talked about today, Simon is responsible for the existence of Priscilla, and I'm going to ask you to welcome him onto the stage right now.
Being here, it's very touching and moving to see such an enthusiastic crowd. Would have thought it, and we've hardly started yet. Thank you, Gary, for your kind words, as I think they say in the business. Look, this was an irresistible project for me. I was rung and asked if I'd like to just pop across to London and meet up with Gary and Liz and Alan to talk about it, and it did seem to me to be the great Australian musical that had been waiting to happen. The film feels a bit like a musical anyway, even though there are perhaps 2 or 3 fairly inept musical numbers performed in it. In reality, it is a show that is suffused with the spirit of music. So it was a joy for me to think that we could bring this piece of work that has had a history of making the underdog into the proud overachiever. So it's got something, a really fantastic feeling for everyone. I thought if I'm going to make this show into something that isn't just a kind of a cult piece, but is something that is going to speak to huge numbers of people, then the 2 things that we have to make sure are there in spades are A, ridiculously lavish and over-the-top costumes, and B, a story with great familial heart to it. So the first bit was kind of easy. It was just like throwing a lot of money and a whole lot of sequins and a whole lot of people for a long time. It is, as Gary said, probably one of the busiest costume shows ever. The ensemble in this show never stop. They're busier backstage than on stage. They whip on a huge costume, they dance and sing their hearts out, they leap backstage, they strip it all off, they put another one on, and they come back on, all for the edification and delight of thousands of Londoners. And not to mention people from Bristol and lower Wapping Sodbury or whatever you call your bizarre little towns over here. But more than that, you know, this is a show that has as its central heartbeat people finding themselves, their self-esteem, through the simple love of another human being. There's the beautiful and unusual love story between Bernadette, the transsexual character, and Bob, the outback mechanic. You know, the stuff that Barbara Cartland dreamed of. And there is, of course, the search at the heart of it by a famous Sydney drag queen for his long-forgotten son. And this particular story guides the show, and for various reasons we decided to go away from the film, which keeps the existence of the son a secret until the very end, and let the audience in on the son, the existence of the son from the very beginning, to keep Tick's story alive and beating. So, as an example of the many ways in which music was used to amplify and extend the emotional lives of the characters, we'd just like to present one of the kind of quieter songs in the show. It also gives us an opportunity to reintroduce you to the three divas who you saw performing at the back of I Will Survive, who kind of presented to us a solution to the whole lip-sync element of the show. A lot of people wonder whether, if they come to see a show, the show of Priscilla, that it's all just going to be people miming to soundtrack. Whereas he didn't want this to happen, and needless to say that the leads and the singers and the cast of the show sing a hell of a lot of the show live. But where the specifics are about lip sync, then these three magnificent women provide that soundtrack, and occasionally in other parts of the show they provide the kind of descant to the heartbeat of the show, with the kind of theatrical ingenuity that has made Priscilla the international success that it is. I would like Todd McKinney to now carry on a chair. Look at that. That's how we got to where we are today. Kind of a stagecraft that you may not be used to over here on the West End. That's how we do it. And now I'm going to leave him alone with nothing but a blue shirt and a modicum of talent to go with, and see how he acquits himself. Ladies and gentlemen, Todd McKinney, say the prayer.
Musical Talk.
And did you notice the effortlessness with Sophie just cleared that chair? I should warn you that staging bears no resemblance to anything that you will see when you come to see the show of Priscilla. It's worked up for the day. The set won't resemble the Spamalot set, rather pathetically masked with black fabric either. Don't worry about it. It will be lavish beyond belief, something for everybody. And I know you could be forgiven for wondering, given what you've seen thus far, why we would in any way bother to cast anyone from London in this show. But we decided, what the hell, when we bring British shows to Australia, we cast Australians, so why not do you the return favour? And in fact, I see some of our remarkable and unbelievable cast here. We were came across a couple of months ago and completed an exhausting series of auditions which always culminate with humiliating any prospective cast member by putting them into particularly unattractive drag and having them wait in a drafty corridor until we're ready to see them. And one of the people, amongst, I must say, many who astonished us with the extraordinary veracity of their English accents, was the gentleman I'm about to introduce you to, who is playing the quintessential Australian bloke. Well, the only Australian bloke, quintessential or not, is really in the entire cast of Priscilla. And as fate would have it, he was born here at the Old Bailey or somewhere like that. And you, if you'd seen any of the work he did auditioning for this character, you would never know it. He is remarkably talented. He landed every moment of the script and the show in a way that I thought was unsurpassable. So it thrills me, this gentleman, to welcome him back to the stage at this moment. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Clive Carter. To Clive now, and he's probably going to give you a paean of gratitude to me, really, something like that, but maybe something to tell you how thrilled he is to be in the show. Did you do that?
No pressure then. Actually, no, they were very good to me. I was a bit disappointed because I won't be wearing a dress in the show, I'm afraid. Yeah, I know, I'm sorry, but I do wear some lovely shorts, and I will be making up my knees. In fact, they were very good because everyone's been sent to hair school and makeup school, and I couldn't. They sent me to the Fred Dinage Conservatory for Bus Mechanics. Thank you so much. No, it's a great pleasure to do this show. What a fantastic, I mean, the costumes and the show. Boy, do we need this. If you get a chance, look on the website, because that's when they first approached me, and I had a look. And it's the campus... Oh, hello? This isn't a campus thing? But it is worth having a look, because it's a fantastic show, and I'm serious. I'm absolutely thrilled to be involved with it. It's going to be such a fun show. And what a joy to come to work every day it's going to be, really. So thank you very much. I'll get off.
Thank you. No. Clive performed Les Miserables in this theatre for 2 years. So, just sick of being gloomy, he's now lay cheerful or something. Yeah. Now, one of the other joys of doing this show is it's kind of like a real on-stage version of London Idol, or whatever you call it, you know, those shows where you scour the entire known territories and find the most talented person you possibly can, who no one's ever heard of. As the young Felicia character in the show is, as you can imagine, you know, that the three lead performers in Priscilla, the stage musical, have to do things that the three performers in the film never had to come anywhere near. Acting's just at the bottom of the barrel in the assumptions. The singing and dancing required is something extraordinary, and we were thrilled in an incredible range of people who auditioned to be able to offer the sadly unattractive young man I'm about to welcome on stage, Mr. Oliver Thornton, the role. Have you got anything to say for yourself, Oliver?
Hello. Well, I'm really excited to be part of this. We were talking about the show earlier, and I saw the film a few years ago. And I remember watching Guy Pearce in his part and just thinking, what an amazing part and what an amazing actor. I'm a little bit terrified to follow in his footsteps, but I'm going to give it a good go. It's a part that when I heard it was coming up, I sort of thought I want to get onto that straight away, and really glad I did, and met you guys and came in and made a complete fool of myself. Crawling across the floor and table and things like that. But I'm really, really glad it worked out. I'm so excited. It's just at your house tonight. But really thrilled to be doing it and working with you guys. So on that note,
one of the great things about the show, I think, that works for audiences of all ages is that it is multi-generational, and there are three kind of it queens at the centre of the show. There is the younger generation as represented by Oliver's character, but right at the centre of the show is the middle-aged middle-aged element, if I could put it that way, and it gives me. I've worked with this fellow before, and it's fantastic to be able to hand the central heartline of the show over to a performer who I feel is so capable of delivering. Not only does he have a 7-year-old son, but he is, in real life, one of the most degenerate and wasted human beings that it's ever been my pleasure to share 7 or 8 martinis with. He's making a kind of a desperate comeback to the West End, hoping to convince you, his most loyal audience, that he is indeed a serious artiste. I happen, perhaps because we come from a similar side of the world, to believe that he is one of the most serious artistes, as well as one of the all-time good guys that I've had the pleasure to meet in the business, and I'd like to welcome him to the stage now, Mr. Jason Donovan.
I am desperate. I do have a 7-year-old son, but above that, it is a pleasure to be in a show which I think I feel is a great Australian export. Is an incredible sort of feel-good. Has some great songs. Is an incredible feel-good piece of musical theatre. No, I'm genuinely looking forward to getting involved in January. I think we start rehearsing and we open in March, and I think I don't need to say too much more than that. So it's going to be a great experience.
Well, thank you, Jason. The third part of the jigsaw is the representative of the great old days of genteel and delicate drag. And it is my very, very great pleasure to be able to welcome to you today and to bring to the West End a man who has been right in at the ground floor of Priscilla, and who I count as actually one of the people amongst its creative team. He's had a huge influence on the emotional life of the show, and he gives one of those performances that meant that when anyone from London came to see the show in Australia, they always said to me, who the hell is that guy? You just have to get him to the West End. I'd like to introduce one of Australia's great music theatre and straight theatre performers, but introduce him to you, and hope that you will, every man and lady, Jack, Jill, of you, take him to your hearts as we have. This is Tony Sheldon.
This is such an honour. This is not the first time anyone's tried to get me over here. I think the first attempt was about 30 years ago when I was doing an Australian musical version of a Goldoni play called The Venetian Twins. And there was an attempt to bring that show over. No dice. It was too hard to bring Australians over. Then when I did Torch Song Trilogy, the producers said, yes, we'll get you to London. And they found a little unknown actor called Anthony Sher, who's got the and he was hopeless, yes. And then the same thing happened when I was doing the producers in Australia. Yeah, we'll get you to London. No, there's always something that got in the way. But Simon and the producers of this show have worked so hard to get me here, and to come to play an Australian role in an Australian written show, and to be surrounded by the cream of our industry in the creative team who have presented the show, and to be in the middle of that and to arrive in the West End with this project, I could not have asked for anything more. I've had 2 wonderful years with the Australian Priscilla family, who are just the best performers, as you can see, and to come and join with these wonderful people and the rest of the cast, who I still haven't met or even know who's in it yet. I can't wait to start this journey all over again and to bring this beautiful show to you. You have so much to look forward to, and it's going to be my pleasure to be a part of this experience. Thank you.
It's been great to welcome these four guys to the stage. We were really just a bit of padding for the cast to get into their next costume change, actually. Most of the costume changes in this show are achieved in about 45 seconds, so in fact I think they've got in and out of 27 costumes in the time that we've been talking. We're just going to close with a small, humble thing, but our own. Give you a final taste of the show. Hopefully, it alone will encourage you to be here. I always like to say to people, that the demographic for this show is extraordinarily high. I was always a little bit anxious when we started running the show, because there's some pretty out there moments in it, and some, pretty confronting scenes, and I would have my eyes anxiously on the elderly ladies in pearls in the audience, and it was, funnily enough, always their hands that slapped their thighs, howled harder and louder than anyone else's, and there were some thighs in that audience. So really, from swaddling clothes to swaddling clothes, this is a show for you. I hope those of you who are here as group bookers we need it. We're just a little colony. We need all the help you can offer us. Go on. Round up. Anyone will enjoy it. There's nothing not to like. So come, join us. We'll leave now and we'll give you one last number. Thanks, everybody.
That was one of the more subtle numbers. This is the first time I've done this. You guys have done it a lot more than I imagine, so you probably know what you're going out to do. Whatever it is, do it in spades. What I've learned is don't let Simon Phillips introduce me ever. And secondly, I've learned there's no depths to which I won't sink to sell tickets. You are the better sporting nation. There's lots more to see. Go away, tell all your friends. It's a wonderful story and it's wonderfully told. See you later.
And those were extracts from the launch party of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, the musical, which has grossed over £41 million in Australia so far, and therefore become the most successful Australian musical of all time, which is just as well, bearing in mind that the butt itself weighs 6 tonnes and has cost £700,000 to make. And I'm pleased it's coming to London first, because it's planned, but it will eventually go to North America, and also in Toronto, and in Germany, and in Sweden over the next few years. So this is really, outside Australia, the first chance to see it. Well, to conclude today's programme, let's have the second half of that fantastic interview that I conducted with the wonderful Julian Fellows. If you remember, last week we concentrated on the work in relation to Gosford Park and Ivor Novello, but today he tells us all about his involvement with Mary Poppins the musical, which of course he wrote with Stiles and Drew and the Sherman Brothers, and which has been a massive worldwide success. So let's join Julian Fellows. Musical talk.
Moving on, if I may, to your work on Mary Poppins. Now, you've already mentioned George Stiles and Anthony Drew, who we've had the pleasure of interviewing before, so we do know them. Cameron McIntosh on his website said, to move Mary Poppins along, we needed to have a book writer who could pull together the existing material but also seamlessly add his or own style. Once again, I remembered an old friend, Julian Fellows. This brings us immediately to how do you address writing a new book for something that's so very well known, at least in one of its forms, which is the film?
Well, what was unusual about adapting Mary Poppins is that it had two parents. Normally you adapt from one parent, and either it's a remake of a film or you're taking from a novel or whatever, or real events. And it's unusual that you have the source material in the books, but you already have a reinterpretation of them in the Disney film, which is iconic. I mean, that's not just the film of the Mary Poppins books. It has become in itself an icon and very, very popular. Deservedly so. I think the film is wonderful. It's a wonderful movie. So that was quite challenging. But on the other hand, the show needed to be a family show. The real challenge was that the film is essentially a children's film. And you may enjoy it as a parent, but you enjoy it as a parent. And it would be unlikely that you would go to the film without children accompanying you. Whereas with the show, although a lot of people brought their children, I'm very, very happy to say, it is too much of an excursion for them to do it if they don't feel they're going to enjoy it themselves. And so you needed the show to acquire, by word of mouth, the feeling that actually it was a very entertaining show for adults too. So
a proper family show rather than a children's show.
Yeah. I mean, nowadays when people say family show, they mean children's show, but actually it's a different term. And so you had to kind of complicate it up a bit and give the adult characters a kind of dynamic and an emotional situation and so on. But also, you know, in a sense, in the film, Mary Poppins arrives to sort out the problems of a family that hasn't got any. The children are adorable. We're told that they've got rid of 105 nannies, but we never learn why, because they couldn't be sweeter. And we all felt, that in the book, the children are problem children. I mean, you know, good, bad Thursday, bad Tuesday, whatever it is, bad Wednesday, which becomes in the show the number temper. That's all from the book. That's all Pamela Travers. Also, the fact that the whole business of the father is very interesting, because Pamela Travers was obsessed with her father. And he was a failure and an alcoholic. And he tried to be a banker, but it all went wrong and blah, blah, blah. And eventually he died very young. She was only, I think, 7 or something like that. And all her life, she felt, if only my father hadn't died, if only he was still here, everything would have been okay. And although I don't mean that she quarrelled with her mother, because she didn't, but she wasn't really interested in her mother. They didn't fall out, but she just wasn't the parent of her heart. It was always this dead father. And in the books, the mother is hardly there. I mean, there's one drawing of her sort of crying on the stair, and that's about it. Whereas the father is there. And what you feel if you're adapting it, because the books are all separate stories, separate episodes, and in an adaptation you have to create an overall arc that links all the separate episodes. And it's no surprise to me that the Disney adapters felt they had to go with the father. So did I, because that's the dynamic. The difference being that in the Disney film, the problems are essentially Disney-esque, you know, with the run on the bank and all this stuff. I felt that what is poignant about Pamela Travers' father was that he was a failure and he had no self-worth, and eventually he became a drunk and died. Well, clearly that doesn't play. So, but nevertheless, in the show, the father has much more of a personality crisis and feels a failure and all the rest of it. And the key to me was that in the books there is this character of his old governess, Miss Andrew, who is horrible. And in those sort of pre-psychological days, Travers invites us to make the link that he is authoritarian and unimaginative and so on because of his childhood damage. And it took very little. You know, I mean, I'm saying I, these are all group decisions, but the fact is that seemed a very logical way to explain George's inadequacy and why his marriage is not going particularly well and so on. George the father, George Banks, and really that was how we came to that conclusion that Mary Poppins has arrived to fix the family, not to fix the children. And the main person who has to be fixed is George. So, I mean, the subtitle of the show is the redemption of George Banks. And once he is fixed, then everyone is fixed. But I mean, that was the point. We were working to this brief of creating a show that had a kind of resonance for adults. And the mother is the main difference. I mean, Disney invented this character who was essentially comedic with the suffragettes and all that stuff. We didn't feel happy about that. I mean, there was one critic in New York who said, "Oh, I so admired her because she was a suffragette." The truth is, you weren't invited to admire her. You were invited to see her as a joke. And we didn't feel that in 2004 or whenever it was we were doing it, that you could say, "Oh, this woman wants votes for women. Isn't that hilarious?" That we're in a different place now. And we all felt very strongly there wasn't a requirement for Winifred to be a comedy character. There are other comedy characters. And so her struggle becomes quite real, that she is trying to please an unpleasable husband. She is trying to be a good mother, but her children find fault with her. She used to be interesting before she got married, but now she seems to have lost contact with herself. You know, how many women can identify with that? Well, most of the audience every night, really. And so that was why we went in that direction with the show.
Now, obviously, you've touched upon how you've tried to fuse what's iconic in the books and iconic in the film. But how exactly do you sort of cull the book, would you say, or the books, I should say, to pull out what do you identify as being a good, stage-worthy and interesting feature and not?
Well, I think there were two imperatives, really. I mean, the one, as I've talked about, finding dramatic excuses for the songs and things. And, I mean, obviously, we knew we couldn't use cartoon. And to a certain extent, the decision was that cartoon would be replaced by dance. And in order to find a dance reason to go into a fantasy world for Jolly Holiday, I was reading the books, and there is this chapter where they go into the park and the statue of Neleus comes to life, and that is all in the books, not in the film. And I thought, well, if we just expand that into all the statues coming to life, then in a sense we've gone into a real place, the park, which Mary makes magical, because, she is a sort of parable, if you like, of how you can make ordinary things magical. That is the message of Travers, that your life may be an ordinary life, but it can be made wonderful and magical if you have a kind of enthusiasm and commitment and blah, blah, blah. And so, in a sense, we didn't want them to go into the park and go somewhere else any more than in the film they do that. What they do is they go into a cartoon version of the park. So we went into a magical dance version of the park, and it was Neleus's story that would give us that. And also, you're always looking for things that can be used to complete the arc at the end of the show. And Neleus's loneliness and missing his father was something which you could resolve very economically with literally a statue. You didn't need 15 pages of dialogue to show that Neleus had got his wish. You just need Poseidon, king of the sea, standing over him. And so, for those reasons, it would serve our turn. But I think, and Mrs. Corrie came out of the book. I mean, there is that extraordinary introduction to the film where Dick Van Dyke sings in his strange voice, and he goes through this whole range of characters like Mrs. Corrie and her daughters who are never seen again. And I always wonder if originally they were going to do another film and something. Anyway, but Mrs. Corrie came in to help us with Super Cal and so on. But the other imperative is to find explanations for the emotional journey. And, for instance, Miss Andrew, and actually Cameron had already decided we should revive Miss Andrew because the film has no villain. And it doesn't really work in a musical show to have no villain. And it seems right that the perfect nanny should be offset by the worst nanny in the world, and which is clearly Miss Andrew. And so she had that. But she also helped us enormously she became a essentially comedic, but nevertheless horrible explanation of George's emotional impairment, if one can use long words. I think that there was an example of where the book actually helped us. So we didn't have to find a villain or invent one from somewhere else, because the book yielded it. So you have these two, you're combing the book, both for excuses for things that you want to do already, and for emotional reasons for the journey. I mean, Cameron's idea, which I thought was absolutely brilliant, and was not me, was that because in the book, by definition, there are 3 real books. Then there's the other 2 that were written later, and they're sort of, and she says in this slightly lame introduction, these happened during the other books, and you think. But the 3 real books, Mary Poppins comes back, Mary Poppins opens the door. And, of course, each time she goes away and she comes back. And he said, let's do that with the 2 acts. And so at the end of the first act, she goes away. At the beginning of the second act, she comes back. And, of course, that frees you up for Miss Andrew and so on and so forth. In the film, she doesn't go away until she goes away at the end. So that is a sort of simple act. But on the other hand, you don't have an interval. So you don't need to make the audience go away thinking, ooh, what happens next? And I thought that that was a very useful borrow from the books. So you have the departure scene, and you know when she gives them the locket, I think, opens the door, and the wind changes with Mary Poppins. I can't remember what the middle one was, but anyway. In the second act, you know that when she gives them the locket and says, I'll stay till the chain breaks, you know that she'll go at the end. Yes. And so there is that kind of rather satisfactory audience thing of pre-knowledge, when you know yes. something that the characters don't know. So all of that came out of the books, but it was serving essentially a theatrical shape. But you read them, and I mean, it's a funny, you're in the bath and you suddenly think, oh, I know the statues, and so it's hard to work it up into a kind of coherent work practice.
Now, you've raised a couple of things in that, and so this is sort of a conglomerate question. It's about how much style can you put into it yourself? How much license did you have to put in yourself? How much would you say that Disney kept a tight rein or gave people license? And also there's the collaborative working relationship with George and Anthony. You're very generously referring to us and we in the collaborative team, and of course that is how it works, but you're still a significant part of that because book writers are very often overlooked.
Yes, the book writer, the forgotten genius of the show. I mean, that's a separate question. The reason people forget about writers is because the writer is the one person everyone wants to forget about. Because the public like to think that the stars thought of these interesting things to say. The director likes to feel that he and the cast somehow came up with the show. Everyone forgets this little fat man with grey hair sitting tapping away somewhere in a room. I think that's particularly strong in movies, actually. I'd say that is less true on the stage, because the stage is very, very collaborative in a kind of everyone there situation. Movies, it tends to move on to different stages. No, Disney were not at all stifling. I loved the Disney representative was Tom Schumacher, who was in charge of the whole thing, who I thought was very imaginative and clever and a very good sounding board for ideas and everything, very positive. I haven't anything bad to say about Disney's involvement, actually. Of course, they felt protective of the Mary Poppins icon or story, whatever. But once they knew that we all felt that, nobody was out there to get Mary. I mean, in a sense, one of the challenges of the show was to be interesting and enjoyable for people who had loved the film. In other words, if they'd seen the film and enjoyed it, and then they came to the show, that the changes they would find would add to their enjoyment rather than detract from it. That was what we were consciously aiming at. And of course, when you're adapting anything, you talk about freedom, you must serve the material. I mean, you can't just suddenly think, I wish this was about the Norman Conquest, You have to work within the perimeter of what you're doing. I mean, I think what I bring, supposedly, is a kind of dialogue, a sort of slightly snappy kind of sophisticated dialogue, which makes adults smile. And I think that was what I was supposed to bring, and I hope that's what I brought.
Oh, I think you did.
And the whole business of an emotional sympathy. I mean, I think that with Winifred Banks, who in a sense is the most complete creation of the show, because she hardly exists in the book. So she was invented once for the film and invented again for the show. But I think that you do feel a great deal of sympathy for her when she suddenly understands her husband's problem and she resolves it. But of course, as for the collaboration, I mean, there is an example of it, that you have this woman being essentially battened down and, and then she meets her husband's evil governess and she realizes, it's hell he's been through as a child. And she decides that's enough of being passive and weak, and from now on, I'm going to get into this fight and so on. But that bit she does in a song. So then, if you like, the payoff of the scenes that I have written comes in a song of George and Anne's, where she actually has the new version of being Mrs. Banks, but it becomes a kind of triumphant march. And she goes back to do battle for the soul of her husband. And, I felt that all of that was very interesting, that you write a scene and then the decision comes that this song or that song is going to be in the scene, and then part of the dialogue will be rendered superfluous because of the lyric, but then you'll say, well, actually, no, there's one bit that ought to be spoken, because if they miss it, then they won't understand this scene. So that will then come out of the lyric and go back into the dialogue. I mean, it's very much collaborative. And then, the director comes on board and he has this idea and that idea. I mean, Richard completely invented the idea that Winifred was an ex-actress and that she'd had this actual career before, which was quite wild, really, in that period. But I think it works because you have a quite a vivid sense that she wasn't nothing before she married him. She was something. And she's lost touch with that. And so then you get that brief and you write it in your own thing. And then the designer appears and says, well, you can't go straight from this room to that room. You've got to have another scene. So then you adjust that. And gradually everyone has their input, including very much Cameron from the beginning. I mean, many of these story ideas I'm talking about started with Cameron. And so, it's nice to say you're part of the creative team, and of course you are, but it is much more of a joint effort than most other things. I mean, in my career, one extreme is the novel, where basically that's your voice, and if someone's reading your novel, they're listening to you. And at the other is the musical, where everyone is having an input. And I mean, there am I putting my ideas in for lyrics, which then Ants or George would rework, and I would, something. So everyone is putting in their 10 cents worth.
Actually, you've raised an interesting point there, is how is it determined that something will be better served as being a song than dialogue or action?
Well, I think, like most things, it's a sort of suck it and see, really. There we had the iconic songs from the film, which we had to incorporate, and we had, in some cases, to find a new plot role for.
To reimagine them.
And Ants re-lyricking chunks of them. Then you had the new music, of which there is far more than a lot of people appear to realise. I mean, it's about half and half.
We were doing the calculations last night, actually. It's 13 songs to 12, I think, isn't it?
And then, a lot of the old songs are reworked, and things like It's a Jolly Holiday, the whole counter melody, boring, that's all new. Whereas the Jolly Holiday song is in the movie, And I remember someone saying, I always loved that bit in the film, because it's not in the film. Which, of course, for me is actually a compliment, because if people think they remember it, it means it's really worked. Then the decision was reached that because they were being invited to see a new Mary Poppins who wasn't Julie Andrews, the very first song should be a new song, so that you have it. And so Practically Perfect was written. And of course, Practically Perfect, I think, is the best song in the show, actually. So that really fitted in. And a lot of the audience didn't realise that wasn't in the film. But then you can't not have Spoonful, because that is an iconic song. So then Spoonful comes later, and there's a different sequence that is used, devised in the cooking because of the sugar and so on. So all of that is going on, and you want to find places in the story where the song you've got to use will come. I mean, the only time where I think we sort of cheated was Supercalifragilistic, because you couldn't possibly do Mary Poppins without it. But clearly, it doesn't really have any organic meaning at all. And in the film, it's actually, if you see it, a rather interminable cartoon sequence which keeps changing from one thing to another, and then you're at the races and you don't really know why, and anyway, on and on it goes, and of course perfectly lovely, but apart from anything else you can't reproduce cartoon. And then because it is about a word, we got into the whole thing of Mrs. Corrie's shop, where she sells language which is out of the book. So there you have a kind of melding of the film and the book to justify it. And I think we got away with it, because I think they performed it so well, and the dancers performed it so well. But we tried to be a little bit more organic than that for most of the other numbers. I think, apart from that, you have I mean, of course, I would say this, wouldn't I? To quote Mandy Rice Davis, but I think you need a bit more dialogue in the beginning so that you get to know the characters, and in movie language, you invest in them, and their predicament becomes important to you, and whether they get out of their troubles, whatever their troubles may be. And so you will find there is one quite long dialogue sequence in the first act where we are really getting to know the problems with the Banks family and getting a vision. After that, you don't need those long dialogue sequences because you're sort of reaping what you've sown, but you've got the one in the house and the one at the bank. And after that, you only really, in a sense, are referring back to those. I mean, the only thing I do think about songs in musicals, which I think this is a very unoriginal observation, is that on the whole, for the rhythm that an audience now demands, they ought to acquire some information during the song, either narrative information or more usually character information, so that we know more about this person or this love affair or this something or other when they've stopped singing. The notion of, that's enough of the story for now, let's just stop and sing a happy song, I don't think plays particularly well anymore. And of course you see that, you tune into some lovely old Rita Hayworth Victor Mature musical and everyone stops while she sings My Girl Sal or something. But and I love it. But I don't think that's a modern rhythm. And on the whole, I think even with the shape of the musical with dialogue then song, as opposed to a sung through musical where they never stop singing, even with that other type, you want to be a little wiser at the end of the song.
Can I ask a quick question about rewrites and sort of getting it ready for the last few minutes before you open, or the previews? There's this thing developing, I think you read it a lot about American Broadway musicals, where they say, well, we wrote the score, or 70% of the score, and then a week before we started trying it out, we chucked all the songs away and we started again, and we locked our composers in a room and they wrote 15 songs. Some people say that's a very good spontaneous way of writing, and some people think that's not so successful. What was the actual experience for you and George and Ants for Mary Poppins?
Well, we were very lucky in our director. I mean, Richard Eyre's a very, very experienced, very, very talented theatre director. And the great danger of that, throwing out, it's all marvellous, is it is essentially, to me, a juvenile concept that something that is brand new is bound to be better than something you've been doing for 2 months. And what is often the result is that the good stuff gets thrown out with the bad. It's rather like a mistake you get with young directors, which is when they've heard a joke 100 times during rehearsal and it no longer makes them laugh and they think it isn't funny anymore. And of course, it isn't funny to them. And then you don't get that from an experienced director. They can tell when something actually is funny. It's just it doesn't make them laugh anymore because they've heard it so often. And so they don't lose good material. I think that when you mount a show, there are some things that work better than you thought and some things that don't quite work, and some setups to a line that aren't quite enough, or and you do make changes then. You also, at the end of the preliminary out-of-town opening, there are always one or two bits. This bit needs to be tightened up. This is dragging a bit, whatever. And I think that's fine. But I think the all-change notion is not fine. If a show needs to have everything thrown out a week before you open, don't open. And that would be my advice, really.
As you've said, half the score was written by the Sherman brothers, very famous, now quite old. Richard Sherman has said of you, Julian Fellows has written a wonderful script, he's a lovely guy, and a brilliant writer, which is a nice thing to have. What was it like working with the Shermans? What was their involvement? And
the Shermans were absolutely darling from the first day. And we saw more of Dick, actually, because he came over and he and his wife came over, and they're a very, very nice couple, but they were completely supportive. I think there was a moment at the very beginning when they were invited to listen to George and Ants, and I think George and Ants went over to New York, I hope I'm not making this up, and played for them and everything else, and they were very happy with what they heard. I think it might have been different if they hadn't been, and they felt that George had understood their music and was developing it and so on. And after that, they were just 100% supportive and part of it, and there at all the premieres and all of this and all of that. And I mean, actually, I thought they were a complete model, if I'm honest, because their enthusiasm made the whole business of reinterpreting the music and making the show new a kind of adventure that was fun for everyone. I think that if they had been sort of... And I must add, actually, to this, that Julie Andrews was exactly the same. She was tremendously supportive, tremendously enthusiastic, and lovely. And, you know, she was, in most people's mind, Mary Poppins. I mean, including completely my wife's, because I come from the generation that read the books. Emma, who's 15 years younger than me, Mary Poppins was Julie Andrews. And, you know, she is, for my money, the best thing in the film, in that her performance is the nearest to the real Pamela Travers character than any of them, really. Very witty performance. But it would have been easy for her to be, I suppose, slightly grudging or slightly dismissive or something or other, none of which happened. She was absolutely lovely. And, you know, I think that for all of us, the fact that the Sherman Brothers and Disney and Julie Andrews were behind the idea of rethinking it and were very enthusiastic about the result, you know, was a tremendous lift, actually. And so, I return all of Dick's compliments with knobs on.
I'll write to him and let him know, shall I? Just final thing, it's had a great successful life. It's gone beyond London. It's now touring Britain. It's been to Broadway, and I understand there are plans for it to go various other European capitals.
And Australasia and various other places around the world. Yeah.
How much have you had a chance to see it elsewhere? Have you?
Well, I've seen it on Broadway. I went to the Broadway opening. We went over during rehearsals and all that sort of stuff. And I love the show on Broadway. There are some things that are slightly different, but I think wholly successful. I mean, also there's something about the Americans, you know, the stage musical is their art form or whatever.
Gift to culture.
It is, and it's in them in a rather marvellous way. I mean, they've, just as you could say, I suppose, that sort of dramatic acting is sort of endemic to the British, classical thingamy, you know, and it seems better when the English theatre are doing it. There is something about an American cast in a musical that gives it a kind of zip, because it's in their bones. And I loved that, actually. I mean, there's nothing like an American chorus. They have a kind of bottled energy that is, wonderful to behold.
So, last question is, Julian, thank you very much for everything you've said. What projects have you on the horizon?
There's always this and that. I've got another book on the go, and various other scripts. I mean, some actually, there's a couple of scripts in America, which I hope at least one will be produced, which have been asleep during the writers' strike, so they're only just getting going again now. And also, my script has been filmed of the young Victoria, you know, about the life of Queen Victoria when she was a young girl, or coming to the throne. And that is about to get involved in the end of the post-production of when you do bits of looping and this, that, and the other. And then it'll be locked, I imagine, in about May and scored and so on. So that's all very much happening and will open this autumn.
Wonderful. Julian Fellows, thank you very much indeed.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Well, that was the wonderful Julian Fellows, and tremendously good company he was as well. Well, that's it for this week's bumper edition of Musical Talk. We've spoken to lots of people, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Remember, you can go to our website and do please have a look at the forums. I think it's always interesting when people have an opportunity to discuss both these programmes and anything in musical theatre. And you can find those forums at www.musicaltalk.co.uk. We'll tune in again next week to Musical Talk, and we'll have more exciting musical talking for you. Thanks very much for joining me.
Copyright Musical Talk 2008.
And here are some musical out-talks.
See, now I have to be careful what I say now, because the last time everything that I said, oh, don't put that in, it went into the bloopers place.
Right, all of. How would I remember that?
Gosh, what a difficult name Sense Space is.
And if only we were recording it.
If only we had some method of recording this for posterity.
Splendid.
Hello.
Now.
You've caused tremendous excitement there. They think I'm a celebrity.
You are a celebrity.
Yes, I am the Rolls Royce of Ruritania. Anyway, moving on.
I was going to say.
Anyway.
Moving on. I'll send you this.
Stop. Right.
How should we do this? Will I just
well, if you don't know by now.
Yes. If you're happy, we'll just talk about the fact that
I
you
think
went.
they just took my photograph.
You'll be on the internet.
Hello.
You check tomorrow. Yes. If they come back in, if I start calling you Lord Philip or something.
Lord
like
Philip.
that.
Yes, that's good.
So, Lord Philip.
And a pair of hand gloves.
Hand gloves.
I'll start that one again.
Gloves for your hand.
And a pair of handcuffs. And do you know the last one? We're being spoken to by a lift.
You went to a launch party.
That's right. Yes.
Lord.
Lord Philip. Yes. I was at the launch.
I'm actually going to see
You're just getting closer and closer to me.
I just realised. Yes. Well, now you're a star.
There we go. Everybody wants a piece of me.
I remember meeting tourists from the north of the country. I was walking in Soho and.
Did you direct them in the wrong direction?
Well, no, they came up to me and said, we want to know where the Palace Theatre is.
I met tourists this morning, actually. I met two ladies from Yorkshire who were trying to find Clarence House, and they were on the wrong bus.
And what show's on at Clarence House?
I have no idea.
Quite a long-running royal song.
Yes. A right royal knees up, that one.
Oh, right. Well, anyway. In this case, this couple came up to me and said, could you tell me where the Palace is?
Oh, back to you,
And
sorry.
I didn't know where the Palace was. And then I said, so what's showing? And they said, Les Mis, and that's how I knew where it was.
Oh.
But so, right, back to you then, Lord Philip.
Okay.
No,
what? I'm very confused. When did you meet these tourists?
Oh, this was years ago.
Oh, okay. Sorry, it wasn't today. I was going to say, well, you sent them in the wrong place because it's not at the Palace at all. It's at the Apollo, isn't it?
It is now. Yes.
Oh, right.
I was going to say. I did say, could you tell us where Les Mis will be in 5 years' time?
Let me just switch on my psychic powers. Anyway. You don't eat popcorn in the theatre.
You don't eat popcorn in the cinema,
well, you do.
Well, I don't.
Well, okay. All right, Thos doesn't eat popcorn in the cinema. So how do you eat popcorn in the theatre then?
I don't actually eat.
Oh,
so
okay.
Give us
It's like a little Dalek, isn't it?
So it was held in the theatre, and you just sit in the seats in the usual way, and they come on stage. So is there a party?
Is there an unusual way to sit in a seat?
Oh, yes.
Is there?
Oh, come on, use your imagination, Josh.
Well, I'm very well behaved at the theatre. The hand movements are just because you're so close to me, Thos. I can't control myself.
I was about to call a policeman.
Well, there's one. Oh, he's gone.
How would you tell people about this, Josh? I mean, what kind of podcast would want to hear about this?
Do you know what I think I would do is, I'd probably sit back and think, do I know anybody in the industry that would be interested in me talking about this for a while? And if I did, then I'd probably give them a call, and then we might go somewhere like the Royal Festival Hall and go up to the top floor.
I like the way you're thinking.
Yeah, and that's how I would sort of plan this if I was planning it, and if I hadn't just run into a stranger with a microphone.
Now you want to get out of the dungeon, don't you?
Help! Let me out!
Erudition's your middle name.
Yes, it is. I could actually talk and make you believe in what I'm saying. I could have just carried that on. It is absolutely a homecoming for Tony Sheldon. He was actually born here.
The problem is your nose is about to knock off the microphone spoffle.
I'll move back then.
Cut quite a lot of this.
Yeah, you're going to have to.